My sister was the princess, and I was the workhorse. She inherited the palace, and I got the dirt. What she didn't know was that her palace was built on my dirt, and the rent was about to come due. This is the story of how I took back not just my family's legacy, but my own self-worth. Growing up, our family was a tiny kingdom, with two very different heirs apparent. My older sister, Lila, was the crown jewel. She was born with a sparkle in her eye, and an effortless grace that seemed to bend the world to her will. She had our father, Richard, wrapped around her little finger from the moment she could coo. She was all glittering smiles and theatrical sighs, a creature designed for drawing rooms and admiration. I, Sadie, was not. I was the quiet one, the practical one. Where Lila floated, I trudged. Where she charmed, I worked. My hands were always more familiar with soil and grease than with nail polish. Our family home, Blackwood Manor, was the perfect stage for our dynamic. It was a sprawling, Gothic revival masterpiece, a symphony of stone and ivy that had been in our family for 5 generations. Lila treated it like her personal castle, a backdrop for her life. I treated it like a living thing that needed constant care, a responsibility I shared with my father. She was the face of the estate, I was its spine. When our father passed away after a long illness, the grief was a tidal wave, but even in the depths of that sorrow, the old dynamics held firm. Lila's grief was a public spectacle, a cascade of elegant tears and dramatic pronouncements. Mine was a quiet, gnawing ache that I kept tucked away, busying myself with arrangements and the grim logistics of death. The day we met with the family lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, to read the will was a cold, gray Tuesday that perfectly matched my mood. The air in his stuffy, book-lined office was thick with the scent of old paper and finality. Lila sat beside her husband, Marcus, a man whose ambition was as sharp and unpleasant as his cologne. He held her hand, patting it with a proprietary air that always made my skin crawl. Mr. Abernathy, a man who had known our family since before I was born, cleared his throat and began to read. His voice was a dry monotone, stripping the document of all emotion, reducing my father's life and legacy to a series of clauses and bequests. He went through the smaller items first, charitable donations, a few heirlooms to distant cousins. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wasn't naive. I knew Lila would get the lion's share. She was the princess, after all. But I held onto a sliver of hope that my father, in the end, had seen me, that he had recognized my quiet devotion. And now, Mr. Abernathy said, adjusting his spectacles, we come to the primary assets. To my beloved daughter, Lila Carmichael, I bequeath the property known as Blackwood Manor, including the main house and all its contents, furnishings and art, to be hers in perpetuity. A perfectly timed, delicate gasp escaped Lila's lips. She squeezed Marcus's hand, her eyes glistening. Marcus puffed out his chest, a smug little smile playing on his lips. I felt the air leave my lungs, a cold fist clenching in my stomach. It was as I expected, yet the finality of it was a physical blow. Mr. Abernathy continued, his gaze flicking towards me for a fraction of a second. And to my beloved daughter, Sadie Blackwell, I bequeath the entirety of the surrounding undeveloped land, comprising the 3 contiguous parcels of acreage that border the Blackwood Manor plot, as detailed in the attached surveys. Silence. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each tick a tiny hammer against my sanity. The surrounding land. It was over 100 acres of woods, fields, and a stretch of marshland. To anyone looking at a map, it was a huge inheritance. But in reality, it was the leftover bit. The dirt patch, as Lila had always called it. It was unzoned, undeveloped, and largely considered undevelopable due to conservation easements my great-grandfather had put in place. It was, for all intents and purposes, worthless. Lila let out a sound that was half laugh, half scoff. She turned to me, her expression a perfect blend of pity and triumph. "Oh, Sadie," she cooed, her voice dripping with condescension. "The dirt patch. Well, I suppose Daddy wanted you to have something to, potter around in. You always did love playing in the mud." Marcus smirked. "Don't you worry, Sadie," he said, his voice oozing false sincerity. "We'll let you know before we bring the bulldozers in. Wouldn't want them to accidentally flatten your favorite mushroom patch." They laughed. A quiet, cruel private laugh that echoed in the silent office. In that moment, the grief I felt for my father curdled into something else, something sharp and hot. It was betrayal. Not just by Lila and Marcus, whose cruelty was as predictable as the sunrise, but by my father. He had seen my years of work, my calloused hands, my dedication to the very soil he had just bequeathed me, and he had rewarded it with a punchline. He had validated their narrative. Lila was the princess who got the castle. I was the stable hand who got the mud. Mr. Abernathy looked at me, his face unreadable, and handed me my copy of the will, a thick, heavy stack of papers that felt like a tombstone in my hands. I stood up, muttered a thank you, and walked out without another word, the sound of their triumphant whispers following me down the hall. The drive away from Mr. Abernathy's office is a blur in my memory, a smear of gray buildings and weeping willow trees, seen through a film of hot, angry tears. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, the thick legal document, a leaden weight on the passenger seat beside me. Every single slight, every casual dismissal from my childhood, swirled in my mind, coalescing into one single, crushing realization: I was invisible. My entire life had been lived in the shadow of my sister, and now, even in death, my father had ensured I would remain there. He had handed Lila the glittering monument of our family's history, and given me the dirt beneath her feet. It felt like a posthumous joke, a final cosmic confirmation of my place in the family hierarchy, the workhorse, the foundation, necessary, but never ever celebrated. When I got back to my small rented apartment, a place I'd deliberately kept modest and functional, I tossed the will onto the kitchen table, where it landed with a sickening thud. I didn't open it. I couldn't. The humiliation was too fresh, too raw. Instead, I sank onto my sofa and let the silence of the room swallow me. The hours bled into one another. I didn't eat. I didn't answer the phone when it rang, knowing it would be well-meaning friends, offering condolences that would feel like sandpaper on my soul. All I could do was replay the scenes of my life, searching for a sign, any sign, that I had misjudged everything. I remembered when I was 10, and Lila was 12. She wanted a pony for her birthday. Not just any pony, but a specific, expensive Welsh cob she'd seen at a show. My father moved heaven and earth to get it for her. I remember the day it arrived in a polished trailer, a beautiful creature with a braided mane. Lila posed for photos with it, giggling as it nuzzled her. She rode it twice. After that, the novelty wore off, and the daily work of caring for an animal, the mucking out, the feeding, the grooming, fell to me, and the groundskeeper. I didn't mind the work. I grew to love that pony. But what stung was that everyone, my father included, would comment on Lila's beautiful pony, never once acknowledging who was actually raising it. I was just part of the machinery that kept Lila's world running smoothly. Then there was her 16th birthday party. The whole of Blackwood Manor was transformed. Tents were erected on the great lawn, a string quartet played on the veranda, and hundreds of people milled about, sipping champagne. It was the social event of the year. My own 16th birthday, 2 years later, was a quiet dinner with my parents. When I'd asked if I could have a few friends over, my father had patted my shoulder and said, "Of course, Sadie, but let's keep it simple. We're all still recovering from the expense of Lila's little get-together." It was always like that. Lila's desires were events. Mine were afterthoughts. It wasn't that my father was unkind. In his own way, he loved me. He was the one who taught me how to read a balance sheet, how to fix a leaking pipe, how to tell the difference between oak and ash. We spent countless hours together, working on the estate. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Sadie," he'd say, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag. "You understand how things work." He praised my competence, my diligence, my stability, but his praise was always private, delivered in the quiet moments in the workshop or the study. His adoration for Lila was public, a grand performance for all to see. He admired my substance, but he was dazzled by her style, and in the end it seemed the dazzle had won. A week after the will reading, I forced myself to leave my apartment. I needed air. I drove out to Blackwood, parking my car on the side of the public road. I couldn't bring myself to drive up the main lane. I walked along the edge of the property, my dirt patch. The autumn leaves crunched under my boots. It was a beautiful piece of land, wild and untamed, with ancient trees and winding streams. It was the part of the estate I had always loved the most, the part that felt most real. As I walked, a familiar figure emerged from the woods. It was Arthur, the groundskeeper. He was a man who seemed to be carved from the very oak trees he tended, weathered and sturdy, with kind eyes set in a wrinkled face. He'd been at Blackwood for 50 years, since he was a boy working for my grandfather. He nodded at me, his expression somber. "Miss Sadie." "Arthur," I managed, my voice hoarse. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the rustling of the leaves. "It's a shame," he said, finally, his voice a low rumble. "A damn shame." I just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He looked from me to the grand house visible through the trees, then back to the woods around us. "Your father was a complicated man, Sadie," he said, his gaze distant. "He saw things other people didn't, especially in people. He knew the difference between a coat of paint and solid timber." It was a strange thing to say, and at the time I dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man offering clumsy comfort, but the words stuck with me, a tiny splinter of doubt in the solid wall of my resentment. A coat of paint and solid timber. Weeks turned into a month. The raw wound of the betrayal began to scar over, leaving a hard, cold knot in my chest. Lila and Marcus wasted no time. A large "for sale" sign went up at the end of the long driveway to the manor. It was a garish, ostentatious thing, advertising a prestigious legacy estate. My legacy, her price tag. I learned from a small article in the local paper that they were marketing it not just as a home, but as a development opportunity, hoping some wealthy buyer would snap it up, bulldoze the history, and put up a series of luxury McMansions. The thought made me physically ill. The catalyst, the moment my passive hurt finally ignited into active fury, came on a brisk Saturday in late October. Lila and Marcus were hosting a lavish pre-sale garden party. They had invited the prospective buyers, a notoriously flashy couple named Harrison, who had made their fortune in tech, along with their architects, and a few local officials they were trying to schmooze. I knew because I'd seen the caterers' vans rolling up the drive earlier that day. Driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain, I walked deep into my woods, to a high point on a ridge that overlooked the manor's back lawn. From there I could see them all. A crowd of people in expensive clothes, holding champagne flutes, scattered across the manicured grass. Lila was in her element, flitting from group to group, her laughter carrying on the wind. Marcus was standing with Mr. Harrison, a portly man in a golf shirt, gesturing expansively at the house and the grounds. And then I saw him point directly towards my woods, directly towards me. I couldn't hear their exact words, but their body language was unmistakable. Mr. Harrison looked over, a quizzical expression on his face. Marcus said something, and both he and Lila laughed. Then Lila, raising her voice so more people could hear, said something that the wind carried clearly up to my hiding spot. "Oh, that?" she called out, a saccharine, dismissive tone in her voice. "That's just my sister Sadie's little dirt patch. Daddy left it to her so she'd have something to keep her busy, I suppose, bless her heart." A ripple of polite, condescending laughter went through the group. They turned their backs on the woods, on me, and went back to their champagne, bless her heart, the dirt patch. My entire existence, my love for this land, my quiet dedication, reduced to a folksy, pathetic anecdote for their amusement. Something inside me snapped. The grief, the hurt, the years of feeling second best, it all burned away, and what was left was cold, clear, and diamond hard. I stood there on my ridge, the wind whipping my hair, and looked down at the party. I looked at the sister who had belittled me, the house that should have been partly mine, and the land that was entirely mine, and I thought, "You think this is your castle, Lila? You have no idea, you're just a tenant." It wasn't about revenge, until it was. It wasn't about the money, it was about respect, and I realized in that moment that some people only understand consequences, not conversations. My father had praised my competence. It was time to put it to use. I walked back through my woods, no longer aimless, but with a firm, determined stride. When I got home, I walked straight to the kitchen table, picked up the thick, neglected copy of the will, and for the first time, I began to read. Every single word. The fury from that afternoon on the ridge didn't dissipate. It focused. It became a cold, clean energy that hummed in my veins. I sat at my small kitchen table under the harsh glare of a single overhead light, the formidable stack of legal papers spread before me. For hours I read. I waded through the dense, archaic language, the heretofores and in perpetuities, forcing myself to understand every line. I read about the charitable trusts, the disposition of stock portfolios, the bequeathing of my mother's jewelry. It was all exactly as Mr. Abernathy had summarized. My heart sank a little with each page, the initial fire of my resolve beginning to feel like foolish, desperate hope. I got to the section detailing the real estate assets. There it was in black and white: Blackwood Manor, Plot 7A, County of Northwood, to my daughter, Lila Carmichael, and then contiguous parcels 8B, 8C, and 8D, County of Northwood, to my daughter, Sadie Blackwell. It was all there, stark and simple. I was about to give up, to slam the thing shut and accept my fate as the family joke. But something, maybe Arthur's cryptic words about solid timber, made me push on. I turned to the appendices. They were filled with dry, tedious attachments: land surveys with metes and bounds, water rights declarations, tax documents. My eyes were burning from the strain, and then I saw it, tucked away in Appendix C, under the heading Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions of Record, was a clause that wasn't mentioned in the main body of the will. It was numbered 17B. My finger traced the small, dense type. Clause 17B. Be it known that the property designated as Plot 7A, Blackwood Manor, is subject to a pre-existing and inseparable 99-99-year land lease agreement, enacted on the 1st of January, 1925. The lessee, the owner of the structure, is granted the right to inhabit and maintain the structure for the duration of the lease. The lesser rights, including all rights of renewal, refusal, and reversion, are irrevocably tied to and transfer with the legal ownership of the aggregated surrounding parcels 8B, 8C, and 8D. Upon the expiration of said lease, the structure and all permanent fixtures thereon revert to the control of the current lessor. I read it once, twice, a third time. The words swam before my eyes, then slowly snapped into razor-sharp focus. A 99-year land lease, enacted nearly a century ago. The rights of the landlord, the lessor, were tied not to the house, but to the surrounding land, my worthless dirt patch. A cold shock went through me, so profound it felt like plunging into an icy lake. I did the math quickly in my head. A lease from January 1925 would expire in January of the coming year. In less than 3 months, my father hadn't disinherited me. He had armed me. He had given Lila the beautiful gilded cage and handed me the only key. The sheer breathtaking audacity of it left me speechless. This was no simple will. This was a chess move, planned decades in advance. He knew Lila. He knew she and Marcus would never ever bother to read the fine print. They would see the words Blackwood Manor, and their greed would blind them to anything else. He had counted on my diligence, my patience, my habit of understanding how things work. It was the ultimate test of character, a riddle only I was equipped to solve. The phrase "blood is thicker than water, but ink on a legal document is thicker than both" popped into my head, and I almost laughed out loud. This discovery changed everything. It wasn't just about getting revenge on Lila anymore. It was about understanding my father. Why would he do something so convoluted, so potentially cruel? Why not just spell it out? The question burned in me. I remembered my father's old roll-top desk, a massive mahogany piece I had insisted on keeping when Lila and Marcus were clearing out his study. They'd been happy to let me have it, calling it a dusty old fire hazard. It was in my small storage unit. The next morning, I was there when the facility opened. The desk was just as I'd left it, covered in a sheet. I ran my hands over the familiar wood, the faint scent of his pipe tobacco still clinging to it. As a child, I'd been fascinated by its secret compartments. He'd shown me a few, but he always hinted there were more. I spent the better part of an hour tapping on panels and sliding drawers in and out, feeling for false bottoms. Finally, my fingers found a tiny, almost invisible catch under the main writing surface. I pressed it, and a thin vertical panel on the side of the desk clicked open. Inside was a small leather-bound journal, and a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. My heart hammered. This was it. I took them back to my apartment and read for hours. The journal was his private confessional. He wrote about his profound love for both his daughters, but also his deep-seated fears. He wrote about Lila's charm, but also her terrifying lack of substance. An entry from 5 years ago stood out. Lila brought Marcus home for the weekend. The man looks at Blackwood, not as a home, but as an asset to be liquidated. He sees the portraits of our ancestors, and I can almost hear the cash register ringing in his head. And Lila, she doesn't see it, or she doesn't want to. To give her the manor outright would be to sign its death warrant. She would sell it for parts to fund a lifestyle I never taught her to value. And then, the entry that made me cry. Sadie patched the slate roof on the west wing today. Didn't tell a soul, just saw it was leaking and fixed it. Her hands were raw. She has my father's hands, my father's sense of duty. She is the true steward of this family's legacy. But I cannot simply give her the house. Lila would contest it, paint Sadie as a usurper, make her life a living hell. The world, even our small world, rewards the loud and the shiny. It overlooks the quiet and the strong. So I must do this the hard way. I must give Lila the box, but give Sadie the lock. I have to trust that Sadie, my clever, careful Sadie, is the only one who will ever bother to read the instructions. It's a terrible gamble, but it's the only way to save our history from my own daughter. It wasn't a punishment, it was a profound, desperate act of faith. He hadn't overlooked me. He had seen me more clearly than anyone. He had trusted my very nature, the part of me the rest of the world dismissed, to be the family's salvation. The weight of his trust settled on me, a heavy but noble burden. The plan forming in my mind was no longer just about vengeance. It was about fulfilling his last wish. My first call was to Mr. Abernethy. I scheduled an appointment for the next day. I walked into his office not as a slighted daughter, but as a landowner with a pressing legal question. I laid my copy of the will on his desk, open to Clause 17b. Mr. Abernethy, I said, my voice steady, I have a question about a land lease. He looked at the page, then up at me over his glasses. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. It was the first time I had ever seen him look genuinely pleased. Ah, he said, I was wondering when you might call about that. Your father was very specific in his instructions. I was to explain the full ramifications of that clause only to the legal owner of the surrounding acreage, and only if she asked about it directly. So it's real, it's legally binding, as ironclad as they come, he confirmed. Your great-grandfather was a shrewd man. He foresaw a time when his heirs might not share his love for the land. The lease was his way of ensuring the house could never be separated from the estate as a whole. A title search would find it, of course, but it's listed as a covenant on the manor's deed, cross-referenced only by parcel number to your land deeds. It's an old, somewhat obscure structure, but perfectly legal. A lazy or hurried search might miss its significance. Your father was counting on that. He became my willing co-conspirator, my general in the quiet war to come. He advised me on the precise legal steps to take, the timing, the wording of the letters that would need to be sent. My second conversation was with Arthur. I found him pruning the rose bushes near the old stable block, a place Lila and Marcus never went. I told him everything. I told him about the lease, about my father's journal. He listened patiently, his hands never ceasing their steady work with the shears. When I finished, he stopped, turned to me, and there were tears in his eyes. He nodded slowly. I knew it, he whispered. I knew he had a plan. He told me once, years ago, we were standing right here. He said, Arthur, the strongest trees have the deepest roots, not the prettiest flowers. He was talking about you, Sadie. He was always talking about you. From that day on, Arthur became my eyes and ears. He gave me weekly reports, disguised as simple chats about the weather. He told me the Harrisons had made a full-price offer. He told me Lila and Marcus had already put a down payment on a ghastly glass and steel penthouse in the city. He told me they were selling off some of the antique furniture that wasn't included in the all-contents clause, pocketing the cash. Every piece of information was another stone in the foundation of my plan. I had the will, I had the law, and I had the moral authority, granted by my father himself. All I had to do now was wait for the perfect moment to let the blade fall. The weeks leading up to the closing were a masterclass in quiet patience. While Lila and Marcus were a whirlwind of frantic activity, I was a study in stillness. They were busy arranging movers, picking out designer furniture for their new penthouse, and bragging to anyone who would listen about the record-breaking sale of the estate. I, on the other hand, was meeting quietly with Mr. Abernethy, drafting the legal documents that would detonate their entire world. Arthur kept me updated. They're having a big argument about the color of the new curtains, he'd report, a twinkle in his eye. Mr. Marcus says, Beige is classic, and Miss Lila says it's the color of death. I listened to these trivialities and felt a cold, calm certainty settle over me. They were rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The closing was scheduled for a Friday, 2 days before the new month began. According to Mr. Abernathy, this was the moment of maximum leverage. The buyers, the Harrisons, would have already wired the funds into escrow. Lila and Marcus would have signed their side of the paperwork. They would be mentally and financially already living in their new reality. They would be at their most vulnerable. On the Wednesday before the closing, Mr. Abernathy and I executed the plan. It wasn't a dramatic, confrontational move. It was quiet, professional, and utterly devastating. He didn't send a letter to Lila and Marcus. That would have given them time to spin a story or attempt some desperate legal maneuver. Instead, he sent a formal, hand-delivered legal notice via courier directly to the Harrisons' closing attorney, and as a courtesy, to the Harrisons' private office. The letter was a work of art, a masterpiece of legalese that was both polite and ruthless. It began by introducing me, Sadie Blackwell, as the sole proprietor of the land parcels surrounding and including the plot upon which Blackwood Manor was situated. It then respectfully drew their attention to Clause 17b of the estate's founding covenants, a copy of which was attached for their convenience. It calmly explained the nature of the 99-year land lease and its imminent expiration in just over 4 weeks' time. The final paragraph was the kill shot. Please be advised, it read, that as the current lessor, my client Miss Sadie Blackwell, has no intention of renewing or renegotiating this lease with any future occupants of the structure. She intends to exercise her full reversionary rights upon the lease's expiration. We wish you the best in your future real estate endeavors. I spent that afternoon in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the fallout. It didn't take long. My phone rang around 4 p.m. The caller ID flashed Blackwood Manor. I took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and answered. It was a sound I had never heard before, a raw, guttural shriek of pure, undiluted rage. Sadie, it was Lila, her voice stripped of all its practiced elegance, now a jagged, hysterical weapon. What have you done? What is this garbage? The Harrisons' lawyer just called our lawyer. They're screaming about some lease. You sent them a letter. You're trying to sabotage me. After everything Daddy gave you. I let her scream, holding the phone a few inches from my ear. When she finally paused to gasp for breath, I spoke, my voice a placid lake in her hurricane of fury. Hello, Lila. I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't send you a letter. Not to me, you idiot. To the buyers. You're trying to sink the deal. It's illegal. It's. She was sputtering, lost for words. Then the phone was snatched away, and Marcus's voice, tight with a strained, menacing calm, came on the line. Sadie, listen to me very carefully. Whatever little game you're playing, it's over. We have a signed contract. What you are doing is called tortious interference with a business contract. Our lawyers will bury you. You'll be paying our legal fees for the rest of your miserable life. Now, you are going to call the Harrisons' attorney and retract this nonsense immediately. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment to turn their own arrogance against them. I don't think I'll be doing that, Marcus, I said, my tone still infuriatingly calm. But I do have a piece of advice for you and my sister. What's that? He snarled. Read the will, I said softly. Read the fine print your high-priced lawyers were apparently too busy to notice. It's all in Appendix C. Have a lovely evening. I hung up the phone. The silence that followed was more satisfying than any shouting match could ever be. I imagined the scene at the manor, the frantic call to their own lawyer, the initial blustering dismissal, followed by a long, terrible silence as he read the documents Mr. Abernathy had so thoughtfully forwarded to his office. I imagined the dawning horror on Marcus's face as his lawyer, the one he was paying $1,000 an hour, had to explain to him that his multi-million-dollar deal was built on a foundation of sand, and that his worthless sister-in-law owned the entire beach. The next day, my phone rang again. This time it was Mr. Abernathy. Well, the hornet's nest has been kicked, he said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. The Harrisons have officially put a halt on the closing and are threatening to sue your sister and her husband for failure to disclose and for misrepresenting the title. Their deposit is locked in escrow, and they are, to put it mildly, incandescent with rage. The news sent a thrill through me. a heady mix of triumph and terror. It was working. The silent machine I had set in motion was grinding their world to dust. Later that day, Arthur called. "Miss Sadie," he said, his voice low. "You've never seen anything like it. They've been shouting all day. Movers came to pick up the last of the furniture they sold, and Mr. Marcus sent them away. He was yelling something about breach of contract. Miss Lila hasn't come out of her room." The silent takeover was complete. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a single threat. I had simply held up a mirror to their greed and incompetence, and the reflection had shattered them. They weren't fighting me. They were fighting a truth that had been lying dormant in a filing cabinet for almost 100 years, a truth they had been too arrogant to ever look for. And now, they were trapped in the very prize they thought they had won. The collapse of their world was swift and absolute. The Harrison deal didn't just die, it imploded, taking Lila and Marcus's credibility with it. The Harrisons, furious at the near-disastrous purchase and the lockup of their substantial deposit, made sure the story of the unsellable Blackwood Manor with its poison pill lease spread like wildfire through the small gossipy world of high-end real estate. The garish for sale sign was quietly removed, but the damage was done. The palace was now a prison. Their grand plans evaporated overnight. The city penthouse, which they had secured with a non-refundable deposit using a bridge loan against the anticipated sale of the manor, was lost. The calls started coming in, from the bank about the loan, from the high-end furniture stores where they'd placed orders, from the caterers for the now infamous garden party. The symphony of their success became a cacophony of consequences. Arthur described the atmosphere at the manor as being like a tomb. The laughter and champagne flutes were replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence, punctuated by bitter arguments that echoed through the half-empty rooms. The cost of simply existing in a house that size began to crush them. The heating bills for the drafty old mansion were astronomical. The property taxes were crippling. The empire they had so proudly claimed was now a financial black hole, sucking them dry. This was when Lila's strategy shifted from rage to manipulation. About a week after the deal fell through, she showed up at the door of my small apartment. She looked terrible. Her usually immaculate hair was a mess. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, and she was wearing a stained designer tracksuit that screamed, "I've given up." The princess was dethroned. She didn't wait for me to invite her in. She just pushed past me and collapsed onto my sofa, the same sofa I had sunk into in despair just a few weeks earlier. The irony was not lost on me. "Sadie," she began, her voice a pathetic whimper. "We have to talk." I leaned against the door frame, crossing my arms. I didn't say a word. "You can't do this," she sobbed, actual tears now streaming down her face. "You can't take the house away from me. We're sisters. We're family. Dad would have never ever wanted this. He loved me." The old Sadie, the workhorse, would have buckled. The old Sadie would have felt a pang of guilt and tried to fix it, to smooth things over. But the old Sadie was gone, buried under the weight of my father's journal. "You're wrong, Lila," I said, my voice devoid of heat, a simple statement of fact. "This is exactly what Dad wanted. I've read his journals. He knew you and Marcus would try to sell it. He knew you didn't care about the legacy. He set this up to protect the manor from you." Her face went pale. The tears stopped as if a faucet had been turned off. You read his private things," she whispered, aghast. "He left them for me to find," I replied. "He trusted me, a concept you and Marcus might want to look up." She tried a different tactic, her voice softening into a wheedling plea. "But it's our home. We grew up there. What about Mom? Think of her memory. All our happy times there." "My happy times were in the woods, Lila," I said flatly, "and in the workshop with Dad. Your happy times were the parties. The house was always just a stage for you, and now the show is over." She saw she was getting nowhere with guilt, so she switched to bribery. "Look," she said, leaning forward, her eyes gleaming with a desperate cunning. "Let us sell the house. We'll give you a cut. A big one. 30%. No, 40. You'd be rich, Sadie. You could buy whatever you wanted." I almost laughed. The money. It always came back to the money for them. They were so transactional they couldn't conceive of a motive that wasn't financial. "It was never about the money, Lila. It was about respect," I said, the words tasting like truth on my tongue. "And you can't buy that." She left in a storm of insults and renewed tears, slamming the door behind her. A few days later, Marcus tried his approach. He sent me a series of rambling, threatening emails from a new high-powered litigation attorney, hinting at a legal challenge to the will based on undue influence and testamentary incompetence. I forwarded them to Mr. Abernathy, who replied with a single sentence: "The statutory window to challenge the will closed 2 months ago. This is the legal equivalent of a toddler throwing a tantrum." The power shift was total. I held all the cards, and they knew it. They were trapped in their grand, cold, expensive monument to their own greed, watching the calendar as the days ticked down to the expiration of the lease. The closer it got, the more their panic escalated. They had nowhere to go, and no money to get there. They had flown too close to the sun, and now they were in a free fall, with nothing but my worthless dirt patch to break their fall, and I had no intention of moving it. The final days of the lease term ticked away with the grim finality of a metronome. On the last day of the month, Mr. Abernathy, following all legal protocols, had a process server deliver the official eviction notice to Blackwood Manor. It gave them 72 hours to vacate the premises. The notice was not just a legal document, it was a death certificate for their entire way of life. That evening, I received a final frantic call from Marcus. His voice was hollow, all the bluster and threats gone, replaced by a raw, ragged desperation. "Sadie, please," he begged. "Lila is a wreck. We have nowhere to go. Just give us some time, a few more months to figure things out." "You had your whole life to figure things out, Marcus," I said, the words cold and clear. "You had a month since you found out about the lease. This is not a surprise. We want one last meeting," he said, his voice cracking, "at the house, tomorrow, to talk this through." I hesitated. There was nothing left to say, but a part of me needed to see it through to the end, to stand in that house not as the overlooked daughter, but as its rightful custodian. "Fine," I said, "tomorrow at noon. But I'm not coming alone." I arrived at Blackwood Manor the next day at precisely 12 o'clock. Mr. Abernathy was in the passenger seat of my sensible sedan, a leather briefcase on his lap. Arthur was waiting for us on the front steps, his arms crossed, his posture as solid and unmovable as the stone columns behind him. He just nodded at me, a look of profound, quiet vindication in his eyes. Together, the three of us walked through the heavy oak doors. The grand foyer, usually so imposing and vibrant, felt like a mausoleum. Boxes were half-packed in corners, islands of chaos in a sea of dust and neglect. Lila and Marcus were waiting for us in the drawing room. The change in them was shocking. They looked like ghosts haunting their own lives. Marcus had lost weight, his expensive suit hanging off him. Lila was pale and drawn, her face a mask of bitter resentment. "Well," Lila said, her voice brittle, "the conquering hero arrives. Have you come to watch them throw us out onto the street?" "I've come because you asked me to," I said calmly, taking a seat in one of the wingback chairs. Mr. Abernathy and Arthur remained standing behind me, a silent, formidable wall of support. Marcus paced in front of the cold fireplace. "Sadie, there has to be a way to work this out. We are prepared to make you a very generous offer. We will sign a new lease. We will pay you rent, a significant amount." "The house isn't for rent, Marcus," I said simply. Lila finally snapped. She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "Then what is it you want?" she screamed, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "What will it take? Just tell us. Is it money? Is that all this has ever been about for you? Fine, tell us the number, how much to make you go away, and let us have our lives back." I let her question hang in the air, the silence stretching until it was uncomfortable. I looked from her frantic, desperate face to Marcus's defeated slump. I looked at the portraits of our ancestors on the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch us. Then I stood up. "It was never about the money, Lila," I said, my voice quiet but carrying more weight than her screams. "It was never about revenge, not really. It was about respect. Respect for me, respect for this family, and respect for our father. He poured his life into this place. I poured my labor into it, and you saw it as a pile of cash. You saw a price tag, and I saw a home. You looked at 100 acres of living history and called it a dirt patch. Dad didn't give you a prize, Lila. He gave you a test, and you failed." I turned to Arthur. My voice was steady, clear and full of a new authority I had never known I possessed. "Arthur," I said, Would you mind starting an inventory of the rooms? I'd like a complete list of what is original to the estate and what is personal property that will need to be removed by Friday. We should start with the silver. That one sentence did what all the arguments and legal notices could not. It made the new reality absolute. It was the sound of the gavel falling. The ownership of the house had transferred not just legally, but spiritually. It was mine. Lila let out a choked, wounded sound and sank back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Her breakdown wasn't theatrical this time. It was total and silent. Marcus just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. All the fight, all the bluster, all the arrogant superiority was gone. He was just a deflated balloon. In that moment, I didn't feel triumph or joy. I felt a kind of sad, quiet finality. The battle was over. They weren't my enemies anymore. They were just people who had made a series of terrible choices and were now finally facing the consequences. I had won. But more importantly, my father's legacy had won. The weeks that followed the eviction were strange and quiet. I didn't move into the manor right away. I couldn't. It felt too much like dancing on the grave of my sister's life. And despite everything, that wasn't a victory I wanted to celebrate. Instead, I hired a small local cleaning crew, and Arthur and I spent a month just breathing life back into the place. We opened windows that had been sealed for years. We polished wood that was clouded with neglect. We repaired the leaky faucet in the kitchen that I'd been telling my father about for ages. We didn't renovate, we restored. Slowly, carefully, I began to move my own things in. My practical furniture looked almost comical in the grand rooms, but it was mine. The house began to feel less like a museum or a prison, and more like a home. Arthur, his job and his home on the estate, now secure for as long as he wanted them, seemed to shed 20 years. He was smiling more, whistling as he worked in the gardens he loved so much. We started making plans together, not for developers or for profit, but for the future. We decided to convert 10 acres of the old fallow fields into a small organic farm, using the historic stables as our base of operations. The dirt patch was going to bear fruit, literally. I heard through Mr. Abernathy that Lila and Marcus had moved into a small 2-bedroom rental apartment across town. Their debts were significant, and their marriage, which had been built on a foundation of mutual ambition and financial aspiration, was reportedly crumbling under the weight of their failure. I didn't feel happiness at this news, but a sense of grim, inevitable justice. Their downfall was not my creation. It was the natural result of their own character. Some people only understand consequences, and their consequences had finally arrived. Living in Blackwood Manor, I finally understood my father's complicated love. His final act wasn't one of cruelty, but one of profound, if painful, wisdom. He knew I didn't need the public adoration he gave Lila. I needed the quiet trust, the shared responsibility. He gave her the thing she thought she wanted, the glittering crown, knowing it would be too heavy for her to bear. He gave me the thing I had always valued, the foundation, knowing I was the only one strong enough to build. He had seen us both for exactly who we were, and that's how it all played out. Now I want to hear from you. Was I right to wait until the last possible second, or should I have told my sister about the lease from the beginning? Let me know in the comments below. And if you have a story about family drama and inheritance, I'd love to read it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about getting the last laugh. Until next time, remember that sometimes the quietest people have the loudest plans.